Absolute evil died free. For the surviving prisoners, the bones of Josef Mengele became a brutal metric of unfulfilled justice. The skeleton on the sterile laboratory table never saw a courtroom. How does the legal system compensate for the deaths of thousands of people? In this case, it does not. In 1979, the fugitive stepped into the cold, salty water of the Atlantic Ocean. He swam off the coast of Bertioga, Brazil. Submersion triggered a massive stroke. Cardiac arrest followed seconds later. The dead body simply drifted on the ocean waves. 34 years of evasion ended in a sudden biological failure. Investigators held thousands of pages of camp records. The forensic and historical evidence of his absolute guilt remained irrefutable. Yet his physical death guaranteed total legal impunity. Police made no arrests. Judges read no verdicts. Mengele sent 400,000 prisoners to the gas chambers at the Auschwitz-Birkenau ramp. In exchange, he spent exactly 0 days inside a prison cell. The architect of the medical Holocaust avoided every human tribunal. His victims carried the trauma of the extermination camps for decades, while the perpetrator expired quietly on a public beach. Under international law, the forensic confirmation of his remains permanently closed all active arrest warrants. The corpse that bypassed the courtroom in 1979 held zero value for its next of kin. Rolf Mengele remained in Europe. He officially refused to claim his father's biological material. The skeleton stayed in Brazil. For over 30 years, the bones lay locked inside a blue plastic bag at the local forensic institute. No grave, no memorial, just unclaimed organic waste. In 2016, the legal status of the remains shifted. The University of São Paulo authorized the transfer of the skeleton to its anatomical department. The architect of the Auschwitz genetics program underwent a final, irreversible transformation. The executioner became a laboratory specimen. Technicians unpacked the remains. The dry clatter of the skull echoed against the metal tables of the dissection room. The man who had exploited medical science to butcher thousands now functioned as a basic educational prop. Brazilian medical students leaned over the cold steel and examined the hairline fractures across his bones. To let students examine this nameless skull in 2016, geneticists in 1992 had to officially prove its identity. For 30 years, international tribunals chased shadows. Sightings in Paraguay, rumors in Cairo, false leads across South America. The hunt yielded nothing but paranoia. What delivered the final sentence to this phantom? The genetic blood markers of his own son. Investigators returned to the exhumed skeleton from Embu. A technician clamped a brittle femur. A surgical drill pierced the degraded tissue. White bone dust settled on the steel tray. The laboratory smelled sharply of sterile chemical reagents. DNA profiling in 1992 was a forensic novelty. Scientists had invented the method just 8 years prior. Forensics had rarely applied it to historical war crimes. Technicians used polymerase chain reactions to multiply the microscopic surviving fragments. They needed a biological baseline to confirm the target. Rolf Mengele sat in the clinic. A needle pierced his vein. Dark blood filled the glass vial. The son surrendered his biology to identify the father. Analysts digitized both profiles. Black bands appeared on the glowing laboratory monitor. The columns represented specific chromosomal loci. One column held the extracted bone material. The other held the fresh blood. Software scanned the geometry of the alleles. Technicians searched for a precise sequential overlap. The biological verdict erased 3 decades of geopolitical failure. The architect of the Auschwitz selections had indeed drowned in 1979. His remains bypassed the courtroom. But biology trapped him. The genetic sequences matched perfectly. 7 years before the invention of flawless DNA testing, investigators lacked genetic tools. In June 1985, they relied entirely on the optical geometry of a bare skull. Experts executed a biometric technique called facial superimposition. Modern digital recognition algorithms did not exist. The procedure demanded exhaustive, jewelry-like manual calibration. Technicians locked the cranium onto a rigid laboratory stand. They projected archival photographs from the 1930s and 1940s directly over the bare bone structure, point by point. Eye sockets, cheekbones, jawline. The historical images merged seamlessly with the skeletal contours. Physiology betrays a human long after the soft tissue rots away. Investigators identified a distinct, microscopic asymmetry in the skeletal frame. The right clavicle and arm bones carried thicker muscle attachment points. The skeleton belonged to a strictly right-handed man. Joint wear exposed an elderly male with a physically active past. The skeletal proportions perfectly matched Brazilian eyewitness descriptions of a foreigner hiding under the alias Wolfgang Gerhard. The forensic team held a global press conference. They declared the visual alignment absolute. The architect of Auschwitz was officially dead. But geometric outlines failed to convince everyone. Dozens of international skeptics formally rejected the visual analysis. The starting point for this visual superimposition required physical evidence. Investigators exhumed a site in a quiet Brazilian cemetery. Workers opened the coffin. It released the scent of damp earth and decayed wood. Specialists extracted the skull. They immediately isolated the jaw and a deformed finger bone. How do you identify a monster without documents? By microscopic bone tissue defects and traces of severe infection. They counted the surviving enamel structures. 7 remaining teeth. Just 7 preserved teeth provided enough data to identify the architect of genocide. Forensic dental identification strictly relies on structural damage. Traces of self-treatment and localized jaw infections act like permanent anatomical fingerprints. Experts measured every physical groove. They directly matched the specific wear patterns against paper medical records from Germany. A lifetime of diseases and injuries remains forever imprinted on the human skeleton. A multinational team scaled up the analysis. Forensic scientists from Brazil, the United States, Germany, and Israel scrutinized the hand anomaly. The subject broke his left hand as a child. The bone healed incorrectly. The resulting bone callus exactly matched the historical files. Before experts in 1992 could finalize the case with DNA tests and facial superimposition, investigators in 1985 had to crack open this nameless grave in Brazil. Standing over the bones, forensic anthropologists officially confirmed the exact structural angle of the childhood hand fracture. June 6, 1985. The physical extraction commenced inside the Embu Cemetery in Brazil. Whose remains were hidden beneath the lid? The initial examination immediately pointed to an adult male with a set of dentures. But first, the ground team had to reach the target. 2 local gravediggers stepped into the marked zone. Pickaxes swung high. The dull thud of heavy steel hitting hardened earth echoed across the site. For nearly an hour, they fractured the dense Brazilian topsoil. Once the ground loosened, the crew discarded the heavy tools. They switched to shovels. The men scraped the dirt away in precise layers to preserve the structural integrity of the burial pit. A rotting wooden coffin emerged. Workers hoisted the box out of the ground. They lowered it onto a sterile plastic tarp. Investigators pried the wooden lid open. Inside lay no intact body. The team found only decayed fabric, worn trousers, and a collapsed skeleton. The decades-long global manhunt terminated in a fragile pile of bones. Before the introduction of DNA profiling in the 1990s, investigators relied on physical metrics for absolute identification. Dental records and artificial dentures provided the definitive biological signature. A forensic specialist reached into the debris. He extracted the skull. The bone tissue crumbled slightly at the edges. Anthropologists on site immediately analyzed the heavy brow ridges and cranial sutures. This structural evidence provided the final metric, officially confirming the exhumed skull belonged to an adult male. The laboratory provided the biological endpoint, but the logistical route to that cemetery in Embu required a paper trail. How did investigators track this specific burial plot? In 1979, the West German parliament abolished the statute of limitations for murder. The legal mandate forced prosecutors to sustain the global manhunt well into the early 1980s. The mechanism of discovery relied strictly on clerical data. Police raided the Bavarian residence of Hans Settelmeyer, a known conduit for fugitive funds. They seized his outbound mail. Agents processed the yellowed old letters. The name Wolfgang Gerhard repeated constantly across the typed pages. The postmarks established a direct vector to Sao Paulo. Brazilian authorities assumed operational control. They identified the primary recipients as Wolfram and Lieselot Bossert. Detectives detained the couple. Interrogators applied clinical, relentless psychological pressure. They placed the intercepted correspondence directly on the table. The Bosserts initially described a quiet German immigrant seeking a peaceful retirement. In reality, they actively maintained a safe house for Josef Mengele and his intricate network of false identities. The contradictory timeline broke their resolve. The couple confessed. Decades of systemic evasion collapsed under basic bureaucratic scrutiny. Officers immediately executed a tactical search at the Bossert residence. Agents systematically dismantled the physical hiding spots inside the house. They discovered the fugitive's personal diaries concealed within the structure. Search teams then extracted and cataloged vintage photographs showing the target operating freely across Brazil. The raid secured the ultimate operational blueprint. Federal police officially confiscated the handwritten journals detailing his precise geographic movements. The confiscated logs abruptly ended on February 7, 1979. The final coordinates placed him directly on the Bertioga coast. He was 67 years old. He stepped into the Atlantic water. His arterial pressure spiked. A severe hemorrhagic stroke struck his brain. Total physical paralysis followed. Salty ocean fluid violently flooded his respiratory tract as his motor controls failed. He choked. He drowned immediately. Why did the death of a mass murderer fail to trigger an international alert? The civilian bystanders pulling the corpse from the surf only identified a quiet local named Wolfgang Gerhard. The Auschwitz physician never faced a criminal tribunal. He never faced a firing squad. A basic cardiovascular collapse terminated his biological functions. Local medics executed a standard physical examination. The coroner classified the event as accidental drowning. Investigators skipped fingerprint verification. They bypassed dental record comparison. Mortuary transport moved the cadaver to Embu, a small municipality near Sao Paulo. Gravediggers lowered a standard wooden box into the ground. A basic marker displayed the assumed identity and the year 1979. Soil covered the remains. The grave stayed completely undetected. The biological failure in the ocean was merely an endpoint. The paranoid flight protocol activated decades earlier. May 1960. Israeli operatives extracted Adolf Eichmann from Buenos Aires. Mossad executed the operation with absolute precision. The geopolitical shockwave hit the fugitive network immediately, forcing an absolute overhaul of all existing operational security measures. Nazi fugitives terminated all public exposure. High-profile targets went deep underground. Mengele received the warning. He abandoned Argentina. He fled to Paraguay. Dictator Alfredo Stroessner granted him citizenship, a temporary shield. But the extraction risk remained critical. The fugitive crossed the border into Brazil. He dropped his previous aliases and assumed a final operational identity: Wolfgang Gerhard. The capture of Eichmann triggered chronic psychological stress. Movement became constant. He shifted between isolated safe houses near Sao Paulo, relying entirely on a micro-network of sympathetic local handlers. Paranoia dictated his biology. Systolic blood pressure spiked. Hypertension wrecked his cardiovascular system. He required clinical intervention. He refused it. Hospitals demanded identification. Exposure meant immediate capture. Global intelligence agencies tracked a phantom. Investigators analyzed dead-end files. Informants generated hundreds of false location reports from Egypt, Chile, and the United States. Long before becoming a hunted target, the subject enjoyed a decade of absolute security. How did the architect of death escape the tribunal? The regime of Juan Perón turned Argentina into a secure hub for fugitives. The escape logistics launched from Genoa. The year was 1949. The so-called rat lines functioned with the unspoken support of sympathetic European officials, ensuring the escape of thousands of criminals to South America. Institutional complicity replaced post-war justice. A desk clerk processed the exit files. Official Red Cross documents lay under the lamp. Fresh blue ink stamped heavily across a black and white photograph. The paperwork established a flawless legal identity: Helmut Gregor. Holding these authorized papers, the fugitive boarded a transatlantic liner. He reached Buenos Aires. The evasion protocols stopped there. He lived openly. A massive expatriate network shielded the new arrivals from any external threats. By the 1950s, the subject abandoned his alias entirely. He reclaimed his real name. He remarried. He walked public streets without looking back. Systemic bureaucratic failure guaranteed his absolute comfort. Maintaining this lifestyle demanded constant revenue. He never faced a financial deficit. Corporate wealth backed his disappearance. His family in Germany continued to transfer financial funds unhindered. 1985. Investigators initiated the exhumation protocol. The dull crack of rotting coffin boards pierced the silence of the cemetery. Workers extracted a heavy wooden box from the dirt. They pried open the lid. Inside lay a nameless skeleton. Wet soil clogged the eye sockets. A forensic technician systematically brushed mud from the fragile skull. Specialists laid the extracted bone fragments on a steel examination table. While his family's wealth previously shielded his transatlantic escape, the physical reality of his evasion ended right here. In 1945, military police placed hundreds of regime leaders in the dock. Josef Mengele freely bypassed the arrest zones. The doctor of Auschwitz vanished. For 40 years, international prosecutors demanded a tribunal for the architect of death. The global public expected a fortified courtroom and a formal execution. Instead, investigators found only a pathetic pile of decaying bones. Time reduced the demiurge of the selection ramps to a clinical biosample. Justice shifted from international courts to laboratory protocols. Anthropologists mapped the cranium. They measured the degraded femurs. Visual markers failed to satisfy the legal archives. The half-century manhunt required absolute biological certainty. In 1992, laboratory technicians executed a complex genetic sequencing procedure. A DNA analysis officially confirmed the remains belonged to Josef Mengele. 4 decades before forensic teams breached his grave, Mengele systematically dissolved into the administrative collapse of post-war Germany. 0 days. That was his total time in a holding cell during the Nuremberg trials. His victims numbered in the hundreds of thousands. How did the architect of industrial murder pass through American filtration camps in 1945? The answer hid on his left shoulder. The mandatory SS tattoo was missing. American infantry detained him. They interrogated a standard agricultural laborer. They inspected his skin for the standard blood group ink. They found nothing. The bureaucratic protocol cleared him. He walked away. By 1949, the continent became unstable. He shifted to the rat lines. These covert transit corridors moved high-value targets toward the Mediterranean. The primary logistical node operated in Genoa. The International Committee of the Red Cross issued approximately 120,000 travel documents to displaced civilians. The escape network weaponized this massive systemic blind spot. The post-war bureaucracy processed paper, not faces. He submitted the forged Red Cross documents. The checkpoint guard stamped the fake passport. He crossed the border. Those Italian escape routes became a strict necessity. By January 1945, Soviet troops were advancing on the exact side of his ultimate clinical triumphs. He operated with absolute calm, a polite smile, immaculate uniforms. He projected pure academic interest. Then, The clinic doors closed. Guards pulled twins from the sorting ramp. Orderlies locked them inside a specialized isolation barrack. The air inside carried the sharp, sterile scent of chemical reagents and chloroform. The subjects received slightly improved rations. They slept on cleaner bunks. It was a calculated psychological trap before the procedures began. The clinical protocol required strict symmetry. Mengele sought the biological formula to mass-produce the Aryan race. Assistants drew precise volumes of pathogens. Needles punctured the skin. Doctors deliberately infected children with typhus. SS medical journals pedantically documented these artificially induced infections, like pneuma, a gangrenous stomatitis. Researchers used the extracted data to study rapid tissue degradation in starved populations. Surgeons routinely omitted anesthesia. Mengele injected chemical dyes directly into the irises of living children. He measured their skulls with steel calipers. If one sibling died from the fever, the protocol dictated immediate action. An orderly delivered a fatal phenol injection to the heart of the surviving twin. Technicians immediately placed both bodies on adjacent steel tables for comparative autopsy. They packaged the harvested organs and shipped them directly to the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute. The clinical machinery consumed pregnant women and people with physical anomalies. They served strictly as raw biological material. The clinical output scaled massively. Hundreds of thousands of humans passed through his selection lines. By the time Soviet troops breached the camp gates, the medical staff had dissected or murdered thousands for sheer anatomical curiosity. Less than 200 twins survived. How much time did it take to send thousands of people from Hungary and Poland to the gas chambers? A single movement of a gloved hand. Before the clinical laboratories consumed hundreds of thousands, every victim had to cross the sorting platform. Mengele assumed his post on the Auschwitz ramp in May 1943. The transport logistics operated flawlessly. Freight trains hauled packed human cargo from Hungary, Poland, and France. Victims survived days inside sealed boxcars without food or water. Then the iron doors slid open. The deafening metallic screech of train brakes collided with the furious barking of SS shepherd dogs. Guards shouted orders. Soldiers physically tore families apart. The concrete platform drowned in panic and noise. Mengele stood perfectly still in the center of the storm. The selection functioned as a rapid, mechanical conveyor belt of death. Left meant forced labor. Right meant the crematorium. A single binary gesture decided the fate of entire generations in fractions of a second. Old men, pregnant women, and young children marched directly to the chambers. He managed the slaughter with a polite, welcoming smile. The executioner on the sorting ramp was not a product of sudden madness. The German academic machine methodically engineered him. His construction started on March 16, 1911, in the Bavarian town of Günzburg. His father, Karl Mengele, operated a highly lucrative agricultural machinery empire. Industrial wealth guaranteed absolute privilege. The son grew up immaculate, polite, and flawless. The actual blueprint for slaughter took shape inside the lecture halls of Munich and Frankfurt. Professors taught racial purity as a strict biological metric. In 1935, the young student secured his doctorate in anthropology. This specific academic credential became his primary weapon. The officially stamped university degree legalized his future human experiments, turning mechanical murder into a legitimate scientific methodology. By 1938, he added a medical degree to his operational arsenal. He found a new mentor. Ottmar von Verschuur directed systematic eugenics programs, focusing heavily on twin biology. The German Research Foundation pumped massive financial grants directly into these clinical laboratories. This steady funding pipeline elevated racial selection to the absolute highest tier of state-sanctioned science. The ambitious scholar seamlessly integrated into the military apparatus. He swore absolute loyalty to the SS. When the invasion orders finally dropped, the doctor packed his academically validated metrics. He deployed to the Eastern Front as a combat medical officer for the Waffen-SS.